figured we couldn't have this kind of conversation around election funding without having representation from the EAC. It has a long history of helping election officials to fill in those gaps. The question has always been, I think back a few years at conferences and people would stand up and say, are we getting any funding? And you're like, no, I don't know, might get some funding, might not get some funding. So there's a real challenge there.
For a while, my job was going to election conferences and saying there's not going to be more federal money. So I'm glad it's changed. Thank you, Adam, Tammy, for the introduction. Big thank you to the Dole and Kennedy Institutes for convening this critical conversation about election funding. It's a topic I think a lot about, but I don't believe we as a community discuss enough. I would have been here no matter what, invited or not. I would have, through the snow.
Be standing outside, looking in the window.
Yeah, I was coming. I mean, again, it's been a great conversation so far. I'm very excited to be here. I have my green tie on for money. We're going to talk about money. Actually, earlier this week, my wife says, hey, what do you want to do for Valentine's Day? And I was like, let's get a head start on this conference. No. That was the wrong answer. But nonetheless, it is certainly an area that I've thought and focused a lot on, and at the Election Assistance Commission is central to our mission and what the agency was created to do. As Adam mentioned, the EAC is an independent bipartisan agency, and we were created by the Help America Vote Act of 2002, which also was really the origin of federal money in election administration. Over the course of time, the federal government, or really since 2002, the federal government has put over $4 billion that has been appropriated to the states. As we heard earlier, that is a small portion, but nonetheless, anytime that the number starts with a B, it is significant. But that has been inconsistent over time. And again, much of my time at the Senate was a time where there was not federal funding. There was nearly a decade between sort of the original tranche and some that came with the original passage of the Help America Vote Act. And then 2018, we started to see federal investment again. You saw since 2018, there's been $955 million in security grants that the EAC has distributed. Since we're into the excruciating details here, for those of you keeping track at home, that was $380 million in 2018, $425 million in 2020, and then $75 million in each of FY 2022 and 23. And then there's also been another $400 million in pandemic-related funds from the CARES Act in 2020. And I'd say that these federal funds have had a tremendous impact. I believe that nearly every significant election administration innovation since 2002 has HAVA dollars as part of the recipe. I'm not saying HAVA dollars get all the credit. It could be a small piece. It could just be the salt or something. But there are HAVA dollars when you look back at so many of the innovations that we've seen in elections. And I think it highlights one of the important things that federal dollars can do. And more recently with the security grants. The security grants have done amazing things to improve the security and integrity of our elections. One of the things that I know increases my confidence in our elections is knowing how this money's been spent and seeing it. We get a front row seat to seeing how this money has been spent across the country. It's replaced paperless equipment in much of the country. It's led to innovations like cyber navigator programs, just countless hours of training and tabletop exercises. And at the end of the day, this money has made a big difference and made our elections more secure. That said, I don't believe the grants, as much good as they've done, I don't believe they've been enough. I think that, one of the things that I think about a lot in this space, so again, January of 2017, elections gets designated as critical infrastructure. As part of that governance structure that is a windy road that we won't go down, each sector creates a sector-specific plan. And the original election infrastructure sector-specific plan states, "It's impossible to make an honest assessment of the election infrastructure subsector's risk and the potential to mitigate that risk without an understanding of the chronic resource issues the subsector faces at all levels of government." Again, all levels of government, as we were talking about earlier today. And so while much of this plan focuses on what can be done to assess and mitigate risk, a certain amount of what can be done is dependent on sufficient funding. If election officials are unable to replace antiquated or unsupported systems in a timely fashion, additional vulnerabilities and risk to the system are created. If election administrators are unable to hire sufficient technical support staff or provide sufficient training to existing staff, this too has real consequences. And that was obviously focused on the cybersecurity space. But as elections have changed in the last 20 years, we continue to see challenges, not only in the cybersecurity realm, but beyond that. And I won't sort of belabor some of those things, as I know too many people in the room are a little bit too familiar with some of these challenges, but recent years have brought new technology and cyber threats. The involvement of sophisticated nation-state actors probing or attempting to access local systems drives home that election administration, while primarily a local function, there is a need for federal support. With the rise of mis and disinformation around election administration, we've seen increased demands on responding to rumors and conspiracy theories and dealing with the potential threats and harassment that often spawn from this inaccurate information. I could go on, but in short, the reality is that elections are now harder than they've ever been to administer, and I believe more expensive. Again, as we know, because there's statisticians in the room, probably depends how you count, but in that, I count the people cost, the hours that people are putting in that they're not getting credit for, the turnover that we're seeing in other areas. We know the job is difficult. And so, I think, okay, well, what do we do about that? Obviously, that's why we're here today. We're here to figure that out. But as we've heard and know, the answer is not easy. And so I'll tell you a little bit about what I think is working, what I've seen with the HAVA grants. I think there's a few things that make the HAVA grants very important. First, they're dedicated election funding. As we heard earlier, too often election funding is passed over. It's competing with a lot of other important issues at the local level, state level, but making sure that elections are funded, I think the dedicated nature of the HAVA grants is a big deal. We see other grant programs, again, where elections is competing with K-12, with law enforcement. Elections just does not get as much attention in the funding realm as many other areas. So I think that's a big deal. And I also think another critical element to HAVA grants are the flexibility. With each state running elections a little differently, with variations amongst the counties, there has to be that flexibility. And again, because the solution may be different. I remember, I think Tammy and I might have had this conversation in the aftermath of 16, trying to drive toward the funding in 2018. A lot of people wanted to prescribe, very specific things around cybersecurity. And it's like, well, this county has dot matrix printers, and that's why they're running an unsupported operating system. And so if you want them to get a new computer and a new operating system, you have to get them new printers. And so making sure that you have the flexibility to make sure what is needed can be addressed. So those, I think, are two things that stand out about the HAVA grants. We know that there are things that are not working. One of those that was mentioned earlier is in a lot of states, not enough money is getting to the local officials. We know that. We hear it all the time. We go to state conferences and hear that complaint, and it's a valid one. But I do think, as was alluded to, figuring out how to do that from the federal level is not easy. The reality is, and particularly when we talk about the large county, rural county divide, I think in a lot of the programs where you see large counties maybe have the capacity to apply for grant programs, have the ability to do the compliance work. I think HAVA grants are great. There are real burdens to compliance with that, and a lot of that falls on the state level as the dollars are passed through there, and obviously they reach out to the locals. I'm not saying that piece of it, but realistically, adding additional administrative burdens to small local offices doesn't seem like the solution to me. I do think, one thing that I've seen, maybe the best solution I've seen out there, House Appropriations Bill, not this year, but in the last few years, there's been a clause that talks about at least 50% of the grants going in cash or in kind to the local jurisdictions. And this isn't perfect, but it allows for the top-down, bottom-up dynamics. And then actually thinking about the last presentation, the notion that you could treat different sizes of jurisdictions, addressing those economies of scale in some ways. HAVA does that in a lot of ways at the state level with the floors where each state, with the 2018 tranche, the $380 million, the formula is primarily population, but there's a $3 million minimum per state, and all the others have a minimum floor regardless of state size. You could extend that and do a minimum per county that would have, a way to address that issue. But so then the other thing, and again, we heard some about this last night, and earlier today, I think is the inconsistency of federal funding. Again, there are some useful points there, but it definitely, from our vantage point or my vantage point, it does create this chicken or egg problem. I think, Secretary Schwab was talking about last night that how, a lot of the states hold some back because they don't know what's coming next. They don't know if there's going to be federal funding. They don't know what the issue of is tomorrow, and that makes sense. But when Congress sees is the money isn't being spent, and so they assume that more isn't needed. And we do our best, and I know a lot of officials do as well, to talk about the things that are the reasons for that, things like procurement timelines. Frankly, a lot of the federal funding comes in election years, and guess when isn't the best time to get a big chunk of money that you might use to buy new voting equipment? Right now. But nonetheless, at least you have it to be able to plan for 2025 if it is to come in a year like this. So if anyone's watching, I know it would be welcome, and we encourage it. But so that said, and just a few others to flag on that. There are things that the federal grants are a drop in the bucket. I mentioned the minimum. In 2018, Delaware got $3 million. They replaced their paperless equipment across the state. Delaware's a small state. That cost them $13 million. Louisiana has not spent any HAVA security grants because they're waiting to replace their equipment. They've got, I'm going to ballpark this, but 15-ish million maybe, give or take a little bit. They're looking at a voting system that's probably going to cost $100 million for the state, maybe more. And so again, the federal portion of that is not that significant, but on the balance sheet, they've got all of that right now. But as soon as they make that procurement decision, they go to zero. And so again, that's one of the things that we have to communicate. I also think something that would be big about consistency, number one, you can better plan for it, you know that, but there's also been brinksmanship associated with HAVA dollars. Jamie Hsu last night talked about the cycle that original HAVA created, and then all the equipment across the country, most of it aged out at similar times. Well, you also saw a dynamic, I already used a chicken and egg reference, and now I'm going to use a game of chicken reference, but where it was like, is there going to be more federal dollars? Do we have to, who's going to blink here? Who's going to pony up money? Let's duct tape this together and see if there's federal money. And so in my mind, if the federal government says, this is, whether it's their portion of the ballot or whatever it is, but this is what is there. This is a national security issue. There is a federal portion of the ballot. This is what we're doing, and there's not more coming. Then that can allow states and locals to adjust. And so those are sort of some HAVA grant pieces, but I do think there's a couple more things. And I worked in the Senate, so I'm filibustering Don's time here. But
That's all right. We'll go to midnight.
don't worry, I'm going to go get my lunch here in a second. But I think there's a couple big things. One, I think we need to do a better job of telling the story of money and of the funding. Like I said, I think the security grants, there's a whole nother bite at the apple on building confidence by talking about that. I also think something that's a little tougher, and this probably won't be as unpopular as what Charles said earlier about consolidation, but there is a cultural shift, I think, in this community. It's been hit on a little bit earlier. To me, election officials are amazing and have been historically neglected, and as a result, there's this culture in elections. It is a community of innovators, and they squeeze everything out of it and get the job done. And as Connie Schmidt noted earlier, are sort of victims of their own success. This isn't a community of squeaky wheels. And I think that, making sure that I think one of the ways that the broader, academic community and others can help is by finding ways to help election officials communicate those resource needs and challenges. Again, telling that story to funders in order to get additional funding at all levels of government. One of the things that that I had a thought about, it might be an okay or so-so idea. It's what my staff would call a great idea. Something simple like an infographic that shows a dollar bill and shows the portion of the ballots, shows the portion of who pays what. Again, that's obviously different in each state. And so sometimes I throw things out there like that, and someone says, well, if only there was a federal clearinghouse for elections that could do that. And that person is usually Matt Weil. And so that brings me to the much talked about earlier part of my journey where I will come to Kansas City potholes, which I know many of you are excited about, but I will tie it in two ways. So one, yes, I think there are all kinds of opportunities with the election administration as a federal clearinghouse, and I think there are real tax efficiencies and economies of scale there. One area that we do is that it's a voluntary program, but the testing and certification of voting equipment. There is not a need for 50 states to have 50 independent testing and certification programs. That is not an efficient use of tax dollars. And I like to say, a dollar well spent at the EAC can save tax dollars more than $50 across the country. And so thinking about the dollars that are spent for us, because realistically, this is another way that the federal government can contribute without just giving grants. In 2019, when Commissioner Palmer and I got to the EAC, that first fiscal year, and I've done some math for you here, so our operating budget was $7.95 million. And to some folks, that sounds like a lot, but most federal agencies start with B's, not M's, billions, not millions. And in a federal context, frankly, that's a lot less than a lot of counties out there in some of the larger jurisdictions. And so conveniently that year I learned a fun fact, and then we were in an oversight hearing, and then Missouri Senator Roy Blunt was the chair of that committee, and I let the committee and Senator Blunt know that Kansas City spent more on potholes than the federal government spends on the EAC. That year it was just under $8 million for us, and Kansas City spent $10 million on potholes. Well, our budget started going up. We made some real progress, and finally last year we eclipsed the 2010 number. So yes, a few things have happened, but we're finally back to where we were in 2010. And, in some ways, that had made me forget a little bit about potholes. We've done some great work. We've hired some great staff. We've made real contributions with that increase in money. So again, potholes were now out of mind. Well, one day I decided to look it up, and as you all know, being close here, Kansas City's become a pretty competitive town. And so just as our budget was climbing, so was the Kansas City pothole budget, from $10 million to 17 to 40. And just last week, Kansas City introduced its upcoming municipal budget, and guess what? It's down a little, but $34.8 million toward another year of historic street resurfacing to reduce the number of future potholes and allow smoother and safer driving for all. And so while I support Kansas City's pothole efforts, I tell you this to say that while we've made progress at the AC, we're still not keeping up with Kansas City's pothole budget. And I think about that in the context, again, of the overall elections community. And, here at the Dole Center, I think about service and sacrifice. You hear the phrase a lot, that freedom isn't free. Well, neither is democracy. And when I think about what election administration is, it's about good governance and customer service. It's not about politics. We've heard about this issue getting politicized. But if it's about serving our voters, if that's our focus, then we have to invest in the infrastructure of our democracy if we want it to keep functioning. And so with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Commissioner Palmer. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. I appreciate being here. Thank you to the Dole Center. And Tammy, thank you for having us. I think that I'll take a little bit different tact. I mean, at the state level, talk a little bit about the HAVA funds. And for me, they were just absolutely necessary because, well, I'm going to step back just a little bit. All right, so with the EAC and HAVA that was developed after the 2000 election, that was a big event, right? Congress came together in a bipartisan way and passed the bill and actually appropriated money to replace the voting machines and sort of the infrastructure of elections. So there was a big event. And COVID was a big event. That pandemic was a huge event, and it really aggravated the strains on the election community and on election personnel. And you see that it's not just sort of the threats of election officials. I think it was just that whole strain of election administration is you see, you see the election administrators fraying at the edges a bit. And I saw that when I was at the state level. And this is where the HAVA grants were so helpful because the budgets that the counties are receiving in the state, it's almost down to the penny about service versus money. The appropriation is there. The only money you have for innovation and sort of trying new things to supplement needs were Help America Vote Act grants. And so when I received those in Florida and in Virginia, that was my way at the state level of really supporting the locals. And they were so happy to have that. And so, you see some states that, they go around, they provide those grants. We did that in Florida. Sometimes it would be a match, sometimes there's not. But it was a wonderful thing to be able to help. We used to say, yes, it's not a huge part of their budget, but it's like a little bit of whiskey at the end of the evening. It took the edge off of otherwise be an extremely tight budget during, some tough fiscal years. The HAVA grants are really unique. It is the most unique grant in the federal government. It really is. There are no strings attached, really. At this point, it's, are you improving federal elections? There's not even a 5-year requirement to use those grants. There's been some debate over the years. Sometimes the appropriators are not clear in their language, but from the very beginning, HAVA grants were like, you can use them over the course of the lifetime, right? It's not just a 5 years or lose. And so that's really unique in the federal government. So that's something we have, the fact that there's not a lot of strings, and it's sort of distributed based on a formula, so there's some sense of fairness. Now, we mentioned how there actually could be some losers in this, particularly localities, but we have to remember that those HAVA grants really give a little bit to everybody. It's like it allows your state and localities to focus on their real needs, on what's important to them. I've tried a couple of different ways to communicate about these HAVA grants to Congress, to state legislators. I focused on one theme about focusing on the fundamentals. It's like, look, we are not trying to reinvent elections. We're not trying to pick a policy decision and fund it. We are focusing on the fundamentals of building bridges and paving roads. We are not trying to weigh one party over another. This is just for the fundamentals, and I try to separate it from the policy discussions, because once it gets into the policy discussions, we're going to lose, or we don't know where we're going to end up, but we're probably not going to win. And so I talk about the fundamentals, but the reality is that there are extreme cybersecurity threats if you listen to the intelligence communities. And so, and this goes back to some of the graphs I've seen, and so much of the HAVA monies are now being spent on cybersecurity issues that some of the monies that were set aside that you would see on the graphs, the percentage used for voting machines, are going down. And so Congress and the federal government has to recognize that these are expenses that now election officials are using. And I had a conversation with the director in Nebraska, and we talked about how the number this year might be 75 million again, which is sort of like a minimum amount. That means about $1 million will go to the state of Nebraska. And he's like, well, that'll keep some of my cybersecurity programs going for another year. In the sentence. I mean, that's it. I mean, there's no innovation. There's no preparing for new voting systems, which we have that out there. So there's none of that. And so that's the situation we're in. One of the things that I'd like to do at the EAC, and it's been great to hear folks that are sort of investigating this, doing research, is we do have opportunities to make requests to Congress for funds, for both the EAC and for grants, and to the president and to the Congress. But we often find ourselves a little bit of whiplash. It's like you come in here and you ask for $500 million, but you won't give us any evidence. You just say they need it. And so what do we need? I'd like to say we need a more professional way of providing this evidence to the Congress. Now, the EAC has, we have advisory boards that we could survey. We do annual reports. We do the EVE survey. So there are mechanisms that perhaps we could, this is, in a nice developed report on an annual, biannual, whatever it is, this is the needs that we are seeing in the country, in the community, and providing that to the Congress so it can help justify a request that comes to the EAC, and it's just not just a request without anything behind it. One of the things that I think Commissioner Hovland will agree, is we had some early success when we first got to the EAC, was we had a number of secretaries looked at particular issues, not just for the EAC, but just grants-wise, on which a bipartisan number of secretaries would sign on to a letter and to the Congress. And that paid off huge dividends. We had eyes open on both sides of the aisle about this is what we'd like to do in innovating. For example, we want to test electronic poll books. We want to, do A, B, and C. And the fact that both parties signed on to it, a number of secretaries, was a big deal that we saw in the Senate and the House. So we want to strengthen our product to the Congress. And we are in a unique position because we're a bipartisan agency. We can produce this in a non-political way and provide this evidence to the Congress. And frankly, it's also part of the feel-good strategy. And it's difficult at times. I know a couple of secretaries, they have their own political, but even like Secretary Schwab was talking about yesterday, is that when you're able to help a locality, it's a big feel-good deal. It's like they need this money. Here is a check from the state of HAVA funds. And it's a big deal, and it makes everyone feel better about the situation. We are in a situation where we have the new VVSG 2.0. It's the next generation of standards for voting systems. And the money is just, no one's right there ready, poised to write a $3 billion check. $2 billion, $3 billion. And so what do? We've talked about more often that the national security needs, that we need to improve our security. Everyone wants to talk about the security of voting systems. Everyone wants to talk about security, but no one wants to put any money to sort of improve those things. So we have those new standards, but it's going to be like the outline of a new aircraft with all the latest technology of a stealth, for example. If there's no money to build that aircraft, you might have the technology, but it's not going to do your military any good. It just sits there. So unless you invest in a new generation of the voting system with the new security, what good is that? We're not making any progress. And so we're in a tough situation because we don't want to downgrade our current systems. But on the other hand, we want to encourage Congress and the legislatures, this is something you need to invest in now. And so we talk, we both mentioned it, how do we change the debate a little bit to this is just a national security imperative that you do this. I'm not making it up. I mean, everybody around me, we're focused on, ballot preparation, ballot insertion, count ballots, audit, let's wash it again later. It's like, but there's this whole debate about the security of it. Maybe we just own it and say, this is a national security imperative that we put more money into elections. One of the, it may be also a little controversial, is, and you heard it from Secretary Schwab yesterday, I hear it from a lot of Republican secretaries of state, those matching funds, brutal. And I'm like, well, I got to tell you, the Congress talks about in terms of state, local, and federal partnership. They don't talk about federal funding. They want partnerships. They want buying it from the states. And the reality of it is a lot of states don't put any money into elections. Zippo. In fact, what they do is they rely on the HAVA funds. So 5%, is that really a match? So maybe there's a dramatic thing we need to do is come in with a 50-50 split. It's like, look, you want this money, it's an incentive, but you need to come up with 50% funding to help your localities purchase capital equipment. And then it's like, and I don't tell you, I actually think that, I know there will be a lot of complaining, I can hear it now, but it's also like, well, if you really want to have these new voting systems or you want new products, I know it's an incentive to have that hanging out there. Believe me, I've heard those debates. So maybe that's the way we go, it's like, look, we're going to put out new money out there, and it's like, it'll be 50% though. And it makes the states make decisions and go to the legislature. Because frankly, the federal government can't do this alone. Really what's happening is you have localities doing it themselves, as we've heard. They can't do it alone. They just can't. And so that's really the point of my comments. I think that we try to take the position that we're in a unique position to educate the Congress. As we grow, we'll have more resources to do that. We want to do it in a more professional and targeted way. We have some opportunities. And so that's what we're building for in the future.
Well, I have two very quick comments before we open it up, and I don't think either of them are controversial, I hope. The first is you mentioned the rural-urban divide, and I remember there were years ago, there was a working group at the EAC, and you mentioned that in the context of grant applications. So how many of you have ever done one of the federal grants? I remember being on the phone with Matt Masterson and Nikki Charlson from Maryland, and we were walking through trying to figure out how to submit these grants. So is there any sort of effort being made to make the grant application easier, or has that changed very much in the last couple of years?
So for the HAVA grants piece, that is, to the states, and again, most folks I think have that sort of figured out. That is a known quantity. I think one of the areas we see, people throw out that there are these other federal pots of money. Our grants team has expanded, fortunately, with our funding increases. And one of the things that we've asked them to do, and we've provided some resources on the website, but also is to look into these other federal pots, because they often have conversations with state counterparts, and people are asking them. But again, it is not necessarily an easy thing to navigate. Some of those funding opportunities, I think a couple years ago there was talk around Burn JAG. Well, that involved coordinating with sort of your local law enforcement, or a lot of the CISA grants involve coordinating with sort of at the state level. There's a state plan from a whole of state government approach. And so, again, I think one of the things to me that again makes the HAVA grants so unique is that they are dedicated election funding.
I'm going to jump in before for Don, because my second piece was about those other types of federal funds or federal grants. So there was, and I was not aware of this until recently, the FEMA grants that had a a designated funding for elections, and I think there's a GAO report that came out that said when they followed up on it, that some of the FEMA offices were like, well, we didn't know what elections would possibly use this money for, so we just, went out and bought some stuff and said it was for elections. So knowing what the landscape is and what the funds are that are available, helping to navigate those waters is really important.
Well, I also think that, HHS funding was a great source of funding. It was over 5 years, and I think there might be 2 tranches of it. And so I really maximized the use of that because, as we vote, accessible voting machines, accessibility of polling places, we used every last penny down to the last year. But I also pain in the ass.
Yeah.
Excuse me, am I allowed to say that? It was a pain. It was a pain, but we did it because, this is good money for the federal government. So that's another area where maybe we go to Congress and say, look, this is great stuff for the election community, and it's focused on voters with disabilities. But I didn't say this in my opening comments. I think one of the problems we have as the election community is we do not have a champion who's willing to get behind election administration funding and say, yes, I'm willing to give up my vote on an appropriation issue, for example. There's no one, a lot of people talk about it, but no one is really there to stand up for the funding. And that's why there may not even be funding this year. For a variety of reasons. So I think one of the goals we have to have is find a nucleus of Congress men and women that are willing to go to the mat for this. And one of the things we've learned, and I think I heard it yesterday, again, was we deal with our oversight committees a lot, the House Administration and the Rules Committee. But in the end, the appropriators are the ones that make the funds. So maybe we need to also, we have to make concerted efforts to get to know them, to incorporate them into our meetings, because the Rules Committee is not appropriating. Neither is the Committee on House Administration. They oversight of us. So, but they're not writing the checks. So we need to focus a bit on where the money is being appropriated.
Great. I'm going to open it up to the room for any questions for the commissioners.
I'm going to praise Don, of course. That last part was maybe the most important thing that you just said. FSGG, the Financial Services and
General
Government, that's the subcommittee, and they're never invited to any of the real election events, and they're not there. And my team talks to them every year, but we are missing the moment there. So I guess you both have worked, in D.C. around Congress. What is the best way to sell the election story to that group, because they're not hearing it yet?
So I think I'll start here, but I think Don's point about having a champion is a big deal. The federal appropriation process is unbelievably opaque, and particularly when it gets into an omnibus funding bill, which has become the new regular order. People don't like to admit it, but it's just how it gets done now. And there are so many competing priorities, and the reality of elections, and this is sad, but it is true, elections is a rounding error in the scope of the federal government. Frankly, part of the reason we ended up with $75 million a few years ago was a rounding error. It was like 500 in the House and 100 in the Senate, and somehow we ended up with 75 because somebody had made a rounding error somewhere else. And that had to get taken down across the board. And so to Don's point on the champion, somebody in that room has to care. Like, it isn't really even enough to fight about, which is shocking, but somebody has to say, I need this. And that is easier said than done, particularly with all the competing interests. That probably just got me fired, by the way. No.
All right, well, let's thank the commissioners for sharing their time with us. They're very, very